In the early 90s, Dallas working girls became the target of a twisted killer.
They're living out there, they're working out there, and now they're dying out there.
The brutal murderer was putting on a show.
He wanted his work to be seen. He was like an artist, laying out the bodies for the public to view.
Collecting grotesque souvenirs.
The first thing we did then is opened this eye socket.
Then they saw that her eyes was missing.
His desire would become insatiable.
They knew that he would strike again. That is the worst nightmare for a detective.
But what was driving his heinous violence?
There's very few times you can look at someone and truly...
In the 1990s, Dallas, Texas was a successful, booming metropolis, looking towards a prosperous future.
The city leaders of Dallas always would promote this city as the gleaming, shining symbol of the Southwest. Pure, beautiful, great skyscrapers. Everyone was successful. But at the same time, Dallas had this great, shiny image. Lurking in the background was crime.
Dallas was a very violent city. Matter of fact, the early 90s, we had our largest rate of homicide that we ever had. In 1991, we had over 500 homicides in the city of Dallas.
And one formerly middle-class district to the south of the city had become the center of Dallas's seedy underbelly.
Oak Cliff had gone downhill. It was crime-ridden. You had lots of crime, you had lots of prostitution, you had lots of drugs.
It was not a place that you really wanted to be unless you were down there for a purpose.
Oak Cliff was just there's a run-down town. It was full of a lot of degenerates. It was a part of Dallas that Dallas was probably ashamed of at that time.
For beat cops Regina Smith and John Matthews, one aspect of the streets would require their undivided attention.
In the middle of the day, you would see prostitutes walking in and out of the street, in and out of stores.
Most of the girls that were out there as prostitutes had a drug problem. Drugs were the crux of their existence. We had established rapport with these girls. You know, we cared about them. And we didn't see them just as prostitutes, we saw them as human beings.
One of the troubled women working in the area was 33-year-old mother Mary Pratt.
Mary was a girl that had worked the streets for quite a while. She grew up not very far from North Oak Cliff, and her family still lived just outside of the city of Dallas.
She loved her family. She had so much great love. And Mary wanted out of the life really bad.
The 12th of December 1990 appeared to be a standard night in Oak Cliff's red light district. Mary had been amongst the scores of girls plying their trade on the notorious Jefferson Boulevard. But the following morning, a gruesome discovery in a nearby residential area would mark the tragic end to a young woman's life.
The body was found right here in this area, and she was partially nude. She had been shot, and she laid splayed out with her arms over her head.
When we got there, it was probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, best I can remember, and the body was just left in the street.
As you can see, this isn't in a remote area where no one could see it. There's homes all around here, people coming and going all the time. It was put here for someone to discover.
The victim would be identified as prostitute Mary Pratt. Despite the displaying of her body, her murder was not initially viewed as out of the ordinary.
It was not unusual for street prostitutes to be beaten up, to be shot. It just seemed to be a standard case.
However, the victim's autopsy would reveal that this was anything but a run-of-the-mill murder.
The medical examiner opened the eyelids to write down the color of the eyes in his autopsy report.
And in this particular case, the medical examiner was shocked to find that the eyeballs were gone.
The eyes had been cut out so precisely that when the eyelids were shut, there were no scars, there was no bleeding, no sign of any bleeding. It was surgically precise.
The FBI would confirm to police that the killer's macabre MO was unprecedented.
The eyeball situation, we didn't hear of murders that were sick like that. It was like a trophy or a souvenir.
When someone's going through the trouble to meticulously cut out an eyeball, it tells us killing alone is not psychosexually sufficient. They have to go above and beyond that and do what gratifies them, even placing themselves at risk for apprehension.
50 years earlier, the streets of South Dallas had been far removed from such brutal crimes. Oak Cliff had been a safe haven for a young couple raising their newly adopted son.
Charles was born in 1933 and adopted 3 weeks later by Fred and Dell Albright, a couple that lived in the heart of Oak Cliff. Fred was a grocer in Dallas. Dell was a stay-at-home mom, and she was very much a stay-at-home mom.
She ran the house. His father, Fred, was kind of in the background, and she doted on him, but she was also extremely strict on him.
She was very concerned about him getting in trouble, getting sick, not eating the right foods. She kept goats in the backyard so he would have goat milk instead of cow milk.
Although Charles's mother had a caring side, he would later recall a strict set of rules.
She would force him to practice the piano. She would have him follow her strict rules of manners. If he didn't drink his milk, if he didn't finish his meals, he was severely punished.
There was occasions where if he wouldn't sleep and take his nap, she would tie him down in bed. If he did something wrong, she would punish him by leaving him in a dark room.
Her domination would have affected him. There might have been anger brewing, especially as she controlled him. But she also was very supportive, so there would have been love, so he would have had a lot of mixed feelings about women.
Although the Albright household was run as a strict regime, the mother and son spent any downtime indulging a shared passion for taxidermy.
They would go get dead animals in the neighborhood, like squirrels and birds, and they would work meticulously on restoring the animals, taking out their insides, sewing them back up. And then the final part of the taxidermy was to take these beautiful little fake eyes that you could order and place them into the animals' eyes.
But his mother was a very frugal woman. She wouldn't pay for these rather expensive marbles for the eyes, so she would just force him to use buttons from her sewing collection.
And he would take a bus down to a local taxidermy shop, and he would run his fingers through the boxes of eyes, just staring at the eyes, but never able to buy them to put on his animals.
50 years later, Charles Albright's neighborhood had just suffered the gruesome murder of prostitute Mary Pratt. But as detectives searched for a lead, the killer was already planning his next attack. In December 1990, a shocking discovery was made on the streets of Oak Cliff, Dallas. 33-year-old prostitute Mary Pratt had been brutally murdered and grotesquely mutilated by the surgical removal of her eyes. As police searched for clues, beat cops Regina Smith and John Matthews turned to the local girls working the red light district on Jefferson Boulevard.
They know the streets better than anyone. They're living out there, they're working out there, and now they're dying out there. The word on the street from the girls was that they felt the murderer had to be somebody that Mary knew, someone that had probably been out there on the street for a significant amount of time.
What the girls were saying, they would think of their worst customers that had treated them badly, and none of it fit the profile of what we were seeing. You know, some of them were just, totally way off.
Police were further baffled by the dumping of Mary's body. She was known to have been working around Jefferson Boulevard, but her body had been discovered in a residential area some distance away.
Mary, like most of the girls, would turn their tricks only in a very small geographic area. They wanted to stay close to their pimp and close to where they had friends. And having the body discovered a long way away from the Jefferson area was quite extraordinary.
Although officers Smith and Matthews had little to go on, an encounter with local prostitute Veronica Rodriguez appeared to offer a break.
I saw this gash on her throat and a gash on her head, and I said, "What happened to you?" And she said, "I almost got killed. I had to jump in a drain to get away from him." And so we were like, "Really?"
Veronica claimed she had been with Mary Pratt on the night of her murder.
She said that she and Mary double dated this John, and that he had attacked him, and that she got away, but Mary did not.
The distraught prostitute would then describe a terrifying ordeal as she fled the scene.
She ran barefoot and partially clothed across an open field, and she was a very small, thin girl, and she fit inside a drainage pipe. And she heard the attacker yelling her name, trying to find her.
She found her way to the house of someone she knew, and that person saved her.
Despite Veronica's dramatic version of events, her drug-induced state put doubt in the officers' minds.
They just thought the story was the kind of story that Veronica told all the time. But she did definitely look like she had been beaten up.
However, just 2 days later, officers Smith and Matthews would cross paths with Veronica once again, whilst checking out a suspicious truck parked up in Oak Cliff's red light district.
We swung open the doors, and that's when we saw Veronica in the car doing business with Axton Schindler.
Schindler was a local truck driver, renting a house in the area.
Veronica was very agitated. She was very upset, and she kept saying, "Well, he saved me. Leave him alone. Let him go."
"Don't arrest him. Don't arrest him. That's the guy I told you about that saved me. He saved me."
But he really didn't kind of verify the story at the time that she said.
But they took his identification, and Axton Schindler listed his residence as in Oak Cliff.
Although police didn't know it yet, Axton Schindler had actually given the address of his landlord, a local man who had grown up in the neighborhood, 57-year-old Charles Albright. As a child in the 40s, Charles had experienced a strict regime at home. It appeared that this disciplined upbringing had paid off at school.
He was very gifted in science. He was a gifted athlete.
If you met him as a boy, you would think he's going a long way.
He was smart and did well in class, but he also was the type of person who did pranks and would get in trouble a lot. He was a good thief. He would steal the test exams and make copies for his friends.
For him, going through the proper channels, like taking your classes, graduating, that wasn't the way he wanted to run his life. He sees the world as a place where you have to always get over on him.
As Albright hit his late teens, his mischievous behavior started to spiral out of control.
He was arrested for breaking into a jewelry store as a boy and stealing a watch. A juvenile probation officer came to see him and did interviews with him. He had never before met a teenager who was able to divorce reality from falsehood.
Albright could convince himself he hadn't committed a crime. He could lie to himself and be very convinced.
Charlie's delinquent behavior would continue to escalate, and he would eventually be imprisoned for a year, aged just 17. However, on his release, he appeared to have mended his ways.
So he goes to Arkansas State Teachers College. He becomes president of the French Club. He becomes editor of the yearbook. He's on the student council. He tries out for the football team, even though he's never played organized football before, and becomes the starting halfback.
He was very charismatic, very laid back, seemed to get along with everyone, lots of superficial charm.
The colourful Albright would also gain notoriety for his outlandish pranks.
Charlie had a friend in college named Andrew, who was dating the most beautiful girl on campus. She broke up with him. In a fit of despair, he tore up her pictures. Charlie slipped into his room, grabbed the photos from the wastebasket, cut out the eyes, and began pasting them on the ceiling above Andrew's bed, in the bathroom where Andrew used. So wherever Andrew went, there were these photos of the ex-girlfriend's eyes staring at him. It was a hilarious prank. Good old Charlie doing a prank with eyeballs.
"40 years later, local prostitutes were still working Oak Cliff's red light district, despite the twisted murder and mutilation of call girl Mary Pratt.
The girls will get picked up, some will get beat, some will get raped, and some will get murdered. That's kind of the life of a typical prostitute.
But Oak Cliff was about to suffer another brutal killing that would strike an ominous chord with investigating officers.
In February 1991, 2 months after Mary Pratt's body was found, the body of another woman was found on the same street in South Dallas.
Right here in this vicinity was where the body of Susan Peterson was found. Her body was partially nude. She had been shot, and she was laying here displayed.
The prostitute's murder bore marked similarities to that of working girl Mary Pratt.
Both bodies were dumped in the same neighborhood. Both bodies were shot. Both bodies were displayed in the same way, as if the killer wanted them to be discovered quickly.
When a killer just dumps a body, they are, first of all, calling the victim garbage, just dumping them in the streets for pickup. Also, this is a brazen statement against the community itself. This is one of yours, deal with it.
They were not just people to be thrown in the streets like that. The pictures I saw haunted me forever. They still do. So what, they did that. It didn't give anyone the right to take their life from them, nobody the right to take their life from them.
Although Susan's murder had come under a different jurisdiction, on hearing the news, Dallas detectives feared her autopsy would reveal the same hideous mutilation inflicted on the face of Mary Pratt.
They immediately called the medical examiner and said, check the eyes. And they got a call back that said, the eyes are missing. In that moment, the alarms went on, because now they knew they had a serial killer.
They knew that he would strike again. That is the worst nightmare for a detective.
He loved, clearly, taunting the cops. He wanted his work to be seen. He was like an artist, cutting out their eyes and disappearing into the night.
The mutilation of the two innocent women was evidence of a most twisted mind at work. Detectives would soon discover that the killer's lust for trophies was far from over. In February 1991, police had established a serial killer was murdering prostitutes on the streets of Oak Cliff, Dallas. Both Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson had been mutilated in the most horrific manner, their eyes surgically removed during the twisted attacks.
They had to get word out to the prostitutes on the street to warn them that there was a killer out there and that the bodies were mutilated in a certain way.
Everybody was scared. You know, if you say a serial killer that's cutting out prostitutes' eyes is on the loose, it caused a great concern.
But despite police warnings, many girls were left with little choice.
The prostitutes remained out. Many of them had drug addictions. They needed money. I felt sorry for them because they were stuck in a situation that they couldn't get out of.
Amidst an atmosphere of fear, one Oak Cliff resident had had to work nights as a paperboy to make ends meet. It was the latest in a long line of jobs for the colourful Charles Albright.
Albright, he couldn't seem to hold the job more than 3 months or he would lose interest in it.
At one point, he bought a lathe and made baseball bats that he sold.
He told people that he was a bullfighter at one time and gone to Mexico.
He got a beautician's degree and called himself Mr. Charlie.
He was an artist at one point.
A guy that worked with him at the beauty shop asked him to paint a portrait of his wife. And Charlie spent hours working on the portrait. Finally, the guy said, "Charlie, when are you going to get done with the portrait?" And Charlie said, "I have just one thing left to do." And the man looked at the portrait, and it was a perfect rendition of his wife, except that the eyes were missing.
But Albright's eccentric demeanour hid a life of petty crime. 22 years earlier, in 1969, he created fake qualifications to land a job as head of biology at a high school east of Dallas.
From there, he coached the football team. High school girls swooned over him. High school boys wanted to be like him. They would come to him for counseling.
He was gregarious, he was charismatic. It was very easy to take people in and make them believe whatever he wanted. That would have made him feel superior.
Having eventually been sacked from his teaching post, Charles Albright continued to commit a series of minor offences throughout the 70s. But 1981 would mark a disturbing addition to his criminal record.
He showed up at this church and then suddenly became quite active in this particular Catholic church. And he befriended a family who had a young daughter.
He liked to talk to the girl, and he would take her to the playground. And at one point, the parents realized after talking to the girl that Charlie had sexually molested her.
The family didn't want to put their daughter through a trial, and the prosecution reached a plea bargain with him, and he was placed on probation.
Charlie was able to keep this completely quiet. It never made the newspapers. So in his world in Oak Cliff, he was still Good Time Charlie. At this church he went to in East Dallas, he was a depraved sexual maniac.
Ten years later, in 1991, panic had set in throughout the wider community of Oak Cliff, following the brutal slaying of two white prostitutes.
By the time the second murder had occurred, it was the kind of thing that the newspapers were going to pick up on.
We had people calling in, trying to turn in ex-husbands and friends, and it made a lot more leads for us to have to run down that we later found out that weren't good.
Once it became a media sensation, one of our concerns was that the killer may change his MO.
Which is exactly what happened on March 19th, 1991, 1 month after Susan Peterson was found.
The body of a third prostitute had been discovered in a residential street. Although the victim's profession matched that of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, the killer's choice of target had seemingly evolved.
There was a couple differences in this case. The first two had been white females, and Shirley Williams was a black female.
The killer's change of MO had resulted in tragedy for the 45-year-old, who, despite police warnings, had remained out working the streets.
When you look at serial sexual murders, in 70% of the cases, they experiment at a crime scene and do something very, very different that they didn't do before. So if you have a series of 5 murders and 4 of the women are white and 1 is African American, that does not surprise me.
Despite any differences, the killer's brazen brutality was still evident.
When the officers arrived, they found her completely nude and her face was mutilated. Her body was near a school, and she was left where all those children could see her.
She had been shot several times, and it was a bloody scene.
With the cause of death established, there was only one thing weighing on the detective's mind.
Of course, the first thing we did then is opened the eye socket.
They checked and they saw that her eyes was missing.
We knew then that we had a third one.
As with the other 2 murders, the eyeballs had been removed from the scene. But this time, the killer appeared to have acted in a frenzy.
Whereas with Mary and Susan, their eyes had been surgically removed, but Shirley lay here and there were marks around her eyes.
This time, the killer didn't have as much time to precisely get those eyeballs out, and he left part of an X-Acto blade in one of the eye sockets.
As police chased down their leads, Oak Cliff resident Charles Albright remained under their radar. Despite his checkered past, the charismatic 57-year-old had become a popular member of the community. Forensic scientist Dr. Irving Stone recalls the 57-year-old as a welcome addition to his seniors' softball team.
Charlie Albright was kind of a happy-go-lucky fella. Looked like a fire hydrant. He was wide-shouldered, strong. He had a great sense of humor. And I think the fellas on the team generally liked Charlie.
If there was ever any tension or conflict on the softball field, even amongst these old guys get pretty competitive, Charlie was the first to back down. He didn't seem to like physical confrontation.
Alongside his busy social life, Charles also seemed to be living in domestic bliss.
He met a woman, a widow from Arkansas named Dixie, who he woos and says he wants to marry.
She fell victim to his charms, and they eventually moved in together. Dixie thought she was living with Prince Charming, who, she would come home to, and he could read poetry to her and that sort of thing.
Increasingly out of work, Albright's main income was from a string of rental houses passed down from his parents. But as the financial pressure mounted, Dixie was forced to become the main breadwinner, unaware that her partner was leading a double life.
What Dixie could not imagine was that when she was at work at a gift shop during the day, that Charlie would get in his car and drive 10 minutes away to the whore motels out by the interstate and visit prostitutes, and sometimes bring them back to one of his rental houses.
He was very smart, so he had the ability to live in a variety of compartments. So, and each of those compartments would have its own sense of morality and sense of identity, and it would depend on what situation he was in or what mood he was in as to what he was going to do.
The working girls who knew him recall a client who liked to take charge.
He went out and bought drugs for women and said he didn't want them on the streets because he worried about them. Oh, y'all are my girls. Oh, I'll go get you some drugs. I would hate to have anything happen to you.
He would pay for some of their meals, or if they needed money, he would give them $100. And that wasn't even necessarily for sex. He wanted to develop these friendships with them. So they looked at him as someone who was safe to be with.
Oh, he was charming when he wanted to be. He told me I had lovely eyes.
But his acquaintances in the red light district experienced a change in Charles Albright's behaviour.
With some of the prostitutes, he began to develop a sadistic relationship.
You saw two different sides of him. You saw a charming, nice side, and you saw an angry side.
He began tying them up. He would hit some of them with rope or with an extension cord. He would yell at them. He would cuss at them. He got very rough in his sexual activities.
I worked in a psychiatric unit for a long time because I'd been a nurse, and I knew something was wrong.
Although Albright's secret life remained hidden, one unexpected episode would leave his softball buddies in a state of shock.
Two young women drove slowly past the softball team right as the game had come to an end, and some man just said as a joke, "I bet they're prostitutes. Hey, Charlie, why don't you go have a taste of that?" And Charlie turned and looked at that man and said, "I hate prostitutes. If I had my choice, I'd kill them all."
One year later, in March 1991, the twisted murder of a third prostitute had shut down Oak Cliff's red light district.
You could not find a prostitute of any race on the street. It cleared the streets, period.
In an atmosphere of fear, beat cops Smith and Matthews would glean some crucial information from working girl Brenda White.
Brenda told us a story about this older white male driving a station wagon who had picked her up. He was very strong, very muscular. He had salt and pepper hair.
He wanted to take her down to some property he had down south. She, being a veteran prostitute, knew not to go.
He became enraged, and she was so frightened that she had to mace him in order to get out of the car.
On hearing Brenda's description of her assailant, the officers then reconsidered an earlier witness statement from another Oak Cliff prostitute.
That brought to mind Veronica's story, because she said her attacker had salt and pepper hair as well.
Veronica Rodriguez had insisted she had witnessed the brutal murder of Mary Pratt before fleeing to the rental house of middle-aged resident Axton Schindler.
Axton was a small guy, a very kind of shy and passive individual, not someone that could overpower these girls. We knew Axton wasn't the killer.
But when Officer Matthews checked out the address Axton had provided, he discovered it was a property near to where Shirley Williams' body had been discovered. Having eliminated Schindler from the inquiry, police turned their attention to his landlord. Further investigation revealed that he owned more than one property within the immediate area.
I started to run a tax record and discovered there were actually 3 pieces of property, one near Shirley's dump site, 2 near Mary and Susan's dump site, all owned by the same person with the last name of Albright.
As a cop, I was saying, this is that son of a bitch right here. That's who is doing this.
But as police closed the net around Charles Albright, they were about to learn they were dealing with an elusive and calculating adversary. During 1991, a depraved serial killer had struck at the heart of Oak Cliff's red light district. Having connected the 3 murders by the bizarre removal of the victim's eyes, Dallas police finally believed they had their man. 57-year-old Charles Albright fit a witness description and owned several houses within close proximity to where the victims' bodies had been found.
The arrest happened in the wee hours of the morning. The tactical team had lined up and were in position surrounding the home.
They burst in, they grab Charlie, who says he has no idea what they're here for.
Having broken the case, Officers Matthews and Smith were tasked with taking the suspect in for questioning.
The atmosphere in the car was just as eerie as one can imagine. It was total silence in the car.
The one thing that I remember is looking back and seeing the darkness in his eyes. It wasn't even like looking into a real person's eyes. It was absolutely amazing and at the same time, absolutely terrifying.
All of the victims had been shot and had bizarrely had their eyeballs removed. But as detectives searched Albright's house, little evidence came to light.
When we started searching the house, we found a fireplace that had a secret cover over the top of it. And once we took that cover off, there were like 7 or 8 guns in there.
None of which were used in the murders of the prostitutes. They do find some X-Acto blades, but they can't connect them to any of the murders. They do not find the eyeballs.
Forensic scientist Dr. Irving Stone was also part of the investigative team that night. Although his search drew a blank, one item found in the living room would leave him in a state of shock.
On the floor in the corner, there was a baseball cap. And I looked at that baseball cap and I said, "What's this guy's name?" And the fellow said, "Charles Albright." And I said, "He's the right fielder on my softball team."
On his return to police headquarters, Dr. Stone came face to face with his former teammate.
The elevator opened and Charlie Albright was ushered out, manacled and in shackles with 2 detectives. And he saw me, he beamed a big smile and he opened his arms and he said, "Irv, come give me a hug." I looked at Charlie and I just shook my head and I moved into the laboratory. But that's the kind of guy Charlie was.
In custody, Albright would remain unperturbed whilst police searched his other properties, desperate to track down the missing body parts.
And we had to search that doggone barn, and it was like a scene from Silence of the Lamb with lizards and snakes and newts. He had them lined up all in that barn, and we thought the eyeballs were going to be in there.
I know that we saw some pickled animals, and on one of them, it even resembled eyes, but it turned out to be, I think, a pig's eyes.
Although the evidence against Albright was still lacking, officers Smith and Matthews would locate the site of Shirley Williams' murder following a tip-off from a local prostitute. The discovery of her coat at the scene provided the turning point in the case.
That directly tied Albright to Shirley Williams.
They found hair on the raincoat that they couldn't identify at first. And the interesting thing was they found this same type of hair in the vacuum cleaner from Albright's house. And they actually had to go to the zoo and have their experts look at it, and they identified it as a squirrel hair.
They knew that he had vacuumed a truck or something in order for those hairs to get, in that vacuum cleaner.
So that became a crucial piece of evidence.
At trial, Albright would deny he had even frequented the red light district. But ultimately the jury found him guilty of the killing of Shirley Williams. Although he wasn't officially charged with their murders, the cases of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson were detailed in court. As Charles Albright faced life in prison, the shattered community of Oak Cliff would try to comprehend why this one-time petty criminal had targeted Oak Cliff's working girls in such a brutal manner.
He was adopted, we knew that. And his birth mother might have been a prostitute. And with him living with the thought that his mother was a prostitute, it might have just festered over the years or something like that.
But for many, it was Albright's unprecedented MO to mutilate his victim's eyes that was truly unfathomable.
Albright had never really accomplished a thing in his life. And I think this may have been a way, he was going to make his mark in the world.
There was incidents in his early life that his mother used buttons for eyes in their stuffed animals. And I usually am very reluctant to attribute future behavior as an adult to events in childhood. But in this particular case, I really think it applies.
He will talk at length about his obsession with eyes to this day. In his prison cell, he reportedly had drawings that he had made of beautiful women's eyes, taped one after another across the wall.
In the aftermath of his twisted brutality, one question remained. Was Charles Albright born to kill?
I think the key to Charlie is to understand, despite all his charm and all his cleverness, and that he had, from the beginning, an antisocial personality. His adoptive mother, Dell, perhaps sensed it. And maybe that's why she raised him so diligently. She knew that her son was going to spiral out of control.
I think Albright was born to be a con artist, to be a person who would do whatever he wanted. And so if murder was something that appealed to him, he was ready to do it.
Even though he had a strange childhood, he wasn't abused in any way. He wasn't sexually abused. He wasn't physically abused, really. I think it was more genetic.
For many, the memory of the brutal murders has faded away. But those who were there will always remember the innocent women who lost their lives.
I miss my friends. Felt like I could have done something. How dare this person come and take their life and cut it short? There was something wrong about her from the beginning. There's just very few times in your life that you can look at someone and truly feel an evil person. And that's the scariest feeling you'll ever get.
The phone rang at 2:14 a.m., slicing through the quiet like a blade, and on the other end was a voice that didn't bother with greetings, didn't soften the words, only said that a body had been found just outside the county line, half buried in frozen soil, and that whatever happened out there was already turning into a cold case the moment the sirens faded. Ohio, winter of 1995, a place where the roads go dark early and secrets settle deep, and before the sun came up, an entire community would wake to the same question whispered over coffee cups and police scanners. How could someone vanish here? And how could a killer walk away unseen? The field sat behind an abandoned grain elevator, a wide, empty stretch of land that smelled of rust and damp earth, the kind of place no one noticed unless something went wrong. The body was discovered by a truck driver who pulled over to relieve himself, his flashlight catching on something pale beneath the dirt, a human shape distorted by cold and time. The deputies arrived first, boots crunching on frost, breath hanging in the air, radios crackling with clipped codes. No wallet. No identification. No witnesses. Just a woman in her late 20s, early 30s maybe, dressed in jeans and a winter jacket, her hands marked with defensive wounds, her face turned slightly away as if she had tried to look from whatever came at her last. By sunrise, the scene was sealed off with yellow tape that fluttered uselessly in the wind, and the local news vans were already parking on the roadside. Reporters spoke in hushed, urgent tones, throwing around phrases like mysterious death and possible homicide, while neighbors stood behind them, arms crossed, staring at the field as if it had betrayed them. This was the kind of town where people noticed unfamiliar cars, where strangers stood out, where violent crime was something that happened elsewhere, on television, not here. And yet, there she was. Unnamed. Unclaimed. Already becoming a headline. The autopsy would later reveal blunt force trauma to the head, evidence of a struggle, and signs that the body had been moved after death. Time of death was estimated somewhere between late evening and early morning, a window wide enough for anyone to slip through. The medical examiner noted something else too, something small but strange. A thin line of red fibers caught beneath one fingernail, synthetic, not matching anything found on her clothing. At the time, it was logged, bagged, filed away. Another detail in a case that was already growing heavy with them. Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking the same questions again and again. Did you hear anything? See anyone? Notice a car parked where it shouldn't have been? The answers blurred together into a familiar pattern of shrugs and apologies. No one had seen a thing. No one had heard a scream. The night, it seemed, had swallowed everything. A local bartender mentioned a woman who matched the description, seen earlier that evening nursing a drink alone, leaving around 10. A gas station clerk remembered someone buying cigarettes, hands shaking, face pale, but couldn't be sure it was the same person. Leads flickered and died almost as soon as they were spoken. Within days, the case took on a name that carried weight and dread, an Ohio cold case in the making. The victim was finally identified through dental records as Sarah Mitchell, 29, recently moved to the area for work, no immediate family nearby. Her apartment was tidy, almost too tidy, as if she hadn't expected to be gone long. A half-written note sat on the kitchen counter, a grocery list interrupted midline. Milk. Bread. Call, nothing after that. No signs of forced entry. No obvious enemies. Her coworkers described her as quiet, dependable, the kind of person who faded into the background until she was suddenly gone. Investigators chased down every angle they could think of. An ex-boyfriend in another state was questioned and cleared. A coworker with a minor criminal record failed to raise suspicion beyond rumor. A passing truck driver was scrutinized, his route traced, his alibi checked and rechecked. Nothing stuck. The red fibers under Sarah's fingernail remained unidentified, a silent fragment of a larger story no one could yet read. As weeks turned into months, the case file thickened, but the truth stayed just out of reach, like something glimpsed in a rearview mirror and then lost. The town tried to move on, but the unease lingered. Parents walked their children to school longer than usual. Porch lights stayed on. Conversations dipped into silence whenever the field was mentioned. Sarah Mitchell's name became shorthand for fear, for the idea that safety was an illusion. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, attention shifted elsewhere. New crimes. New stories. The headlines shrank. The investigators were reassigned. The evidence boxes were sealed and shelved. Years passed. The field grew over. The grain elevator was torn down. New people moved into town who had never heard the story, who didn't know why some of the older residents still glanced toward that empty stretch of land with something like guilt. The case officially went cold, a phrase that sounded clinical but felt like a sentence. No arrest. No answers. Just a file number and a name etched into memory. But cold cases have a way of waiting, of holding on to their secrets until someone stumbles over them again. And in this one, buried beneath outdated reports and fading photographs, was something no one had understood at the time, Something small enough to be ignored and powerful enough to change everything. A piece of hidden evidence that would sit in the dark for decades, silent, patient, until the moment it resurfaced and forced a reckoning that no one in Ohio had seen coming. The night Sarah Mitchell died never truly ended. It stretched forward year after year, a long shadow cast over a community that learned to live with unanswered questions. And somewhere in that shadow, the truth waited, tangled in fibers and memories, ready to turn a forgotten cold case into something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Time did what it always does to unresolved violence. It blurred the edges, softened the outrage, dulled the urgency until the case became a story people told rather than a wound they felt. Inside the sheriff's office, Sarah Mitchell's file sat in a metal cabinet with hundreds of others, the label yellowing, the ink fading, but the contents unchanged, frozen the way she had been found, frozen the way that night refused to move on. Detectives came and went, administrations shifted, and every few years someone new would pull the file, skim the pages, and feel the same hollow frustration settle in their chest. The photographs still hit hard. The field at dawn. The shallow grave. The marks on her hands. Even after years, there was something unsettling about how ordinary everything looked, how easily that place could have passed for nothing more than another empty patch of Ohio land. That ordinariness was part of what made the case so difficult. No dramatic chase. No obvious suspect. No single moment where everything went wrong in a way that could be neatly traced. Just a woman alone, a night gone quiet, and a violence that left almost nothing behind. The red fibers came up again and again. Every detective lingered on them a little longer than the others. Synthetic. Red. Thin. They didn't match her clothes. They didn't match the carpet in her apartment. They didn't match anything found at the scene. In the mid-1990s, forensic databases were limited, comparison work slow and inconclusive. The fibers were sent to a lab, compared against known samples, and returned with a shrug disguised as a report. No match. No conclusion. Another dead end. Witness statements were reread, voices from the past echoing through typed transcripts. The bartender. The gas station clerk. A neighbor who thought they heard a car door slam sometime after midnight but couldn't be sure. Each detail felt like it might be important if only it could be placed in the right order. But time eroded certainty. Memories changed. Some witnesses moved away. Others passed on. The living town forgot, but the file remembered everything. Then there was the phone call. It didn't come in 1995, or even in the years immediately after. It came nearly a decade later, late one afternoon when the office was quiet, the kind of call that almost went to voicemail. The voice on the other end was hesitant, strained, asking whether anyone was still working on the Sarah Mitchell case. The caller didn't give a name, just said they had remembered something. Something small. Something they weren't sure mattered. They had been driving that night, passing the grain elevator, and they'd seen a car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. They hadn't stopped. Hadn't thought much of it at the time. It could have been anyone. A breakdown. A wrong turn. But the image had stayed with them, resurfacing years later in a way they couldn't ignore. The problem was the details. The caller couldn't remember the make of the car. Couldn't remember the license plate. Couldn't even say for certain whether it was a man or a woman standing beside it. Just hazard lights. Just a sense that something was off. The lead was logged, added to the file, and quietly joined the pile of maybes and what-ifs that defined the case. Another flicker. Another fade. As technology advanced, so did hope, thin and cautious. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. Cold case units became more than a buzzword, a recognition that old evidence might speak in new ways. Sarah's case was reviewed again, this time by a small team tasked with re-examining unsolved homicides from the 1990s. They approached it differently, not looking for a single dramatic clue but for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that had been overlooked because it seemed too ordinary or too insignificant. They focused on timelines. Sarah left the bar around 10. She was last seen walking alone toward the parking lot. Her apartment was only a short drive away. Somewhere between there and home, something intervened. There were no signs she had planned to meet anyone. No phone records suggesting a late-night call. Her car was found parked near her apartment, undisturbed, keys missing. That detail had always bothered investigators. Why would she leave her car behind if she intended to go somewhere else? Why were the keys never recovered? One theory suggested she had been forced out of the car. Another suggested she had stopped willingly, perhaps to help someone. The Midwest has a reputation for politeness, for pulling over when someone appears stranded. It was an assumption investigators were uncomfortable with but couldn't dismiss. The hazard lights sighting, vague as it was, suddenly felt heavier. Not evidence, but possibility. The fibers were re-examined. New tests confirmed what had been suspected. The material was consistent with automotive upholstery from the late 1980s to early 1990s, commonly used in certain models of sedans and trucks. It was still broad, still frustratingly nonspecific. But it narrowed the universe just enough to make detectives lean in. This wasn't from her clothing. This wasn't random debris from the field. It had traveled with her, embedded beneath her nail during a struggle. They pulled vehicle registration records from the area, focusing on cars matching the upholstery profile. Hundreds of names. Thousands, once nearby counties were added. It was overwhelming, the kind of data that threatens to drown momentum before it even begins. Still, the team pressed on, cross-referencing with criminal histories, with traffic stops logged around that time, with any report that placed a vehicle near the grain elevator that night. Patterns emerged, faint and uneven. A cluster of late-night stops. A handful of individuals with histories of violence who lived or worked nearby. One name surfaced more than once. Not as a suspect, not officially, but as a recurring presence in peripheral records. Traffic citations. A noise complaint. A domestic disturbance call years later. Nothing that would have justified an arrest in 1995. Nothing that even put him near Sarah Mitchell directly. But his vehicle, a dark-colored sedan registered in the early 1990s, matched the upholstery type. Red fibers. Synthetic. Common, yes, but not meaningless. When detectives tried to track him down, they hit another wall. He had moved. Changed jobs. Changed addresses. At one point, he had left the state entirely. There was no single moment where he vanished, just a gradual slipping away that mirrored the case itself. Attempts to interview him were delayed, postponed, lost in bureaucratic shuffle. By the time contact was made, memories had cooled, defenses hardened. He denied knowing Sarah. Denied being near the grain elevator. Denied everything with an ease that came from knowing there was nothing concrete tying him to the crime. The interview ended the way so many had before it, with polite words and quiet frustration. Another name added to the list of people who might know something but weren't talking. Another door closed. The case slid back toward dormancy, kept alive only by the stubborn refusal of a few investigators to let it die completely. Outside the station, life went on. New crimes took precedence. Budgets tightened. Cold cases were a luxury, an act of faith rather than efficiency. Sarah Mitchell's name appeared occasionally in anniversary articles, brief mentions that asked readers if they knew anything at all. The tips that came in were sparse and often useless. Psychic impressions. Rumors recycled from decades earlier. Nothing that could withstand scrutiny. Yet beneath all of it, something had shifted. The fibers were no longer just an oddity. The car theory lingered. The idea that Sarah's last moments involved a roadside encounter, brief and fatal, refused to fade. It haunted the case like an afterimage, shaping every new review, every late-night discussion among detectives who couldn't quite let go. Cold cases don't announce when they're about to change. They don't flare up with obvious signs. They smolder, quietly, waiting for the right pressure, the right mistake, the right advancement to force the truth into the open. And in Ohio, as the years piled up and the past seemed safely buried, the evidence that would eventually break everything wide open was still there, still intact, still misunderstood, waiting for the moment when someone would finally see it for what it was. The silence surrounding Sarah Mitchell's death felt permanent. But silence, like cold, can preserve as much as it conceals. And what it preserved in this case was not just unanswered questions, but the fragile, dangerous possibility that the answer had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, biding its time. By the time the case resurfaced again, the building itself had changed. New paint on the walls, new computers humming where filing cabinets once stood. The sheriff's office looked cleaner, more efficient, but beneath the surface it carried the same ghosts. Sarah Mitchell's name was typed into a modern database now, her case scanned and digitized, every photograph converted into pixels, every report searchable with a click. Progress on paper. But the truth was still trapped between the lines. The renewed interest didn't come from a breakthrough. It came from boredom, from routine, from a detective killing time on a slow night shift, scrolling through cold case files the way other people scrolled through old photographs. He stopped on Sarah's case not because of the crime scene or the victim profile, but because of a single note buried deep in the supplemental reports. Evidence transferred. Property room. Box 117B. Fibers red, synthetic. Logged. Stored. Never destroyed. Most cold cases lost pieces over time. Evidence misplaced. Samples degraded. Labels peeled off and vanished. The fact that Sarah's fibers still existed at all felt like an anomaly, a quiet defiance of entropy. The detective requested the box the next morning, half expecting it to be empty or worse, missing entirely. When the evidence technician wheeled it out, dust-coated but intact, something shifted in the room. It wasn't hope exactly. It was recognition. This mattered. Inside were sealed envelopes, yellowed with age, handwritten dates from 1995, still visible in blue ink. Gloves were put on. The chain of custody was reviewed, every signature a small act of faith passed down through decades. When the envelope containing the fibers was opened, they looked unimpressive, almost insulting in their simplicity. A few thin strands. Red. Faded. The kind of thing you could brush off your sleeve without noticing. And yet, they had survived where so much else had not. The lab work took time. Weeks stretched into months as samples were prepared, compared against updated reference materials, run through processes that hadn't existed when Sarah Mitchell was alive. The detective checked in regularly, careful not to let anticipation creep into his voice. Cold cases punished optimism. They had a way of turning excitement into embarrassment. Still, when the call finally came, it landed with weight. The fibers weren't just automotive upholstery. They were a specific blend, manufactured by a regional supplier that had contracts with only a handful of car makers during a narrow window of years. The lab didn't offer certainty, but it offered direction. Models. Makes. Production ranges. Suddenly, the universe of possible vehicles collapsed from thousands to dozens. The abstract became tangible. The past sharpened. Records were pulled again, this time with precision. Registration databases were messy, incomplete, but workable. Vehicles matching the profile, registered within a 50-mile radius in 1995, were flagged. Many had been sold, scrapped, or lost to time. Owners had moved, died, disappeared. But some names persisted, reappearing in other systems like echoes refusing to fade. One of those names was already familiar. The same man whose dark-colored sedan had drawn quiet attention years earlier. At the time, he had been a non-event, a coincidence wrapped in plausibility. Now, his vehicle matched not just generally, but specifically. Upholstery type. Production year. Even color range. Red fibers were no longer just common. They were contextual. The decision to re-interview him wasn't dramatic. No press conference. No task force announcement. Just a phone call, polite and non-committal, requesting a conversation about an old matter. He agreed quickly, too quickly, the kind of cooperation that felt rehearsed. When he walked into the interview room, he looked older, heavier, more settled. Time had given him the confidence of someone who believed he had outlasted suspicion. The interview began the way all such interviews did, with small talk and gentle reminders. Ohio. 1995, grain elevator. Woman found dead. He nodded at the right moments, feigned concern, expressed sympathy. He said he barely remembered that year. He said he was working long hours back then. He said he didn't drink much, didn't go out late, didn't stop on the roadside for strangers. Each denial landed smoothly, practiced without sounding forced. Then the questions narrowed. His vehicle, the year, the interior. Had he ever replaced the upholstery? Had he ever transported heavy objects in the trunk? Had anyone else driven the car around that time? The detective watched his body language shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. A tightening of the jaw. A pause before answering. Not enough to accuse. Enough to note. When the fibers were mentioned, his reaction was immediate. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said everyone had red upholstery back then. It was the most common color. He said the roads were full of cars just like his. He said it didn't prove anything. He was right, technically. But he had also revealed something else. Familiarity. He knew the argument before it was fully made. He knew where the conversation was going. The interview ended without fireworks. No confession. No slip dramatic enough to justify cuffs. Just a sense that the air in the room had thickened, that something unsaid had been pressed close to the surface and then forced back down. The detective wrote his notes carefully, choosing words that would survive scrutiny. Defensive. Evasive. Knowledgeable. None of it was enough. Not yet. What came next wasn't a chase. It was paperwork. Old, tedious, relentless paperwork. Phone records were re-examined, even though they were incomplete relics from a pre-digital age. Work schedules were requested from companies that barely existed anymore. Old insurance claims were pulled, the kind that documented accidents, repairs, replacements. It was in those records that another fragment emerged. In early 1996, just weeks after Sarah Mitchell's death, the man had filed an insurance claim for interior damage to his vehicle. The description was vague. Stains. Wear and tear. Cleaning required. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't illegal. But the timing sat heavy. He had paid out of pocket for some repairs, declined further inspection. The upholstery had been partially replaced. Individually, none of it mattered. Collectively, it began to form a shape. A narrative that wasn't solid enough to present in court, but too coherent to ignore. Detectives began to look at the man's history through a different lens. Domestic calls once dismissed as minor now carried weight. A restraining order filed years later, quietly settled. A pattern of short moves, changing addresses whenever attention lingered too long. They spoke to people who had known him in the mid-1990s. Former coworkers. Neighbors. An ex-partner who hesitated before agreeing to talk. She described mood swings. A temper that flared without warning. Nights when he came home late, said nothing, smelled of cleaning chemicals. At the time, she hadn't questioned it. Now, decades later, the memories returned with an edge that made her voice shake. Still, the case resisted closure. No weapon. No eyewitness. No DNA linking him directly to Sarah Mitchell. The fibers, powerful as they had become, were circumstantial. Strong, but not definitive. Prosecutors were cautious, unwilling to gamble on a case that could collapse under cross-examination. The phrase reasonable doubt hovered over every meeting like a warning. And so the case stalled again, not from lack of belief, but from excessive caution. The file grew thicker, the timeline tighter, the suspect clearer. But clarity wasn't proof. The community remained unaware that anything had changed, that beneath the calm surface of daily life, an old crime was being slowly excavated, layer by layer, with tools sharpened by time and persistence. For Sarah Mitchell, the years had already taken everything they could. Her life reduced to evidence, to interviews, to lab reports and speculation. For the man at the center of the renewed investigation, the years had offered protection, distance, the comfort of thinking he had outrun consequence. And between them stood a justice system balancing patience against urgency, haunted by the knowledge that cold cases don't stay cold forever. They warm, gradually, dangerously, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The hidden evidence was no longer hidden. It was breathing now, exerting pressure, changing everything in ways that could no longer be contained. And the question that lingered, sharper than ever, was not whether Sarah Mitchell's case would break open, but whether it would do so before time claimed one last victory. Pressure doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, tightening over time until even the smallest movement feels dangerous. That was how it felt inside the investigation now, a sense that every step mattered more than before, that the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. The suspect knew it too. He hadn't been charged, hadn't been named publicly, but something in his behavior shifted after the second interview, as if he could feel the past moving closer. Detectives noticed it first in the little things. He stopped returning calls as promptly. When he did answer, his tone was guarded, clipped. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. Who else had they spoken to? Why no? What exactly were they looking at? Innocent people asked questions too, but these carried an edge, an awareness that suggested he understood the stakes better than he let on. He was no longer just responding. He was measuring. Surveillance wasn't an option without stronger justification, so investigators relied on patience and proximity. They talked to people around him again, gently, carefully, as if handling something fragile. One former neighbor remembered seeing him late at night, cleaning his car obsessively in the driveway, even in cold weather, even when it didn't seem necessary. Another recalled a sudden, unexplained sale of furniture not long after 1995, items that vanished without replacement. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it sounded like someone erasing traces without knowing exactly what needed erasing. The ex-partner was contacted again, this time by a different detective, someone she hadn't spoken to before. She hesitated, then agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet room, coffee growing cold between them, and she talked about fear she hadn't known how to name back then. About nights when he came home with scratches on his hands, shallow but unmistakable, blamed on work, on clumsiness. About a jacket he wore obsessively for months and then suddenly threw away. Redlined. Synthetic. She hadn't connected it to anything until she saw Sarah Mitchell's photo again. Memories are unreliable, detectives knew that. Trauma reshapes them. Time distorts them. Still, patterns mattered. And this pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. They compared her statement with others, aligning dates, checking whether those scratches coincided with Sarah's estimated time of death. The overlap wasn't perfect. It never was. But it was close enough to make the room go quiet when the timelines were laid side by side. Then came the vehicle. The sedan that had once been so ordinary it blended into the background. Records showed it had been sold years earlier, transferred to a salvage yard after a minor accident. The yard still existed, though barely, a patchwork of rusted metal and paperwork no one wanted to deal with. When detectives tracked it down, they found fragments of the car's history still intact. Not the upholstery, it had been stripped long ago, but the VIN, the service records, the proof that this car had been exactly where the fibers suggested it was. The salvage yard owner remembered the car vaguely. Said it was unusually clean inside when it arrived, considering its age. Said the owner had been insistent about removing personal items himself before handing it over. Again, nothing illegal. Nothing definitive. Just another weight added to a scale that was slowly tipping. The investigation shifted focus from what had happened to how it could be proven. Prosecutors were brought in earlier now, their skepticism a necessary counterbalance to investigative momentum. They asked the questions that hurt. Where is the physical link? Where is the DNA? Where is the moment you can point to and say, without hesitation, this is when it broke? The answers were careful and complete. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful, but only when woven tightly enough to leave no gaps. This weave still had holes. And then, quietly, another piece surfaced. It wasn't found in a lab or a warehouse. It came from a retired officer cleaning out his garage. Old boxes. Old notebooks. Things he'd taken home over the years, intending to organize them someday. Inside one of those boxes was a small evidence bag, unlogged, unprocessed, forgotten. A keyring. Rusted. Plain. Found near the field in 1995, but never conclusively tied to Sarah Mitchell because her keys were missing and the bag had been mislabeled. It had slipped through the cracks, carried out of the system by accident. The keyring didn't match her apartment. Didn't match her car. But one of the keys was distinctive, an older model used by certain sedans in the early 1990s. The kind of key that fit the suspect's vehicle. When detectives tested it against the vehicle's records, against replacement orders, against manufacturing specs, the alignment was chilling. It wasn't proof, not by itself. But it was proximity. It was presence. The suspect was asked about it. Shown a photograph. Asked if he recognized it. He stared at it longer than necessary, then shook his head. Said keys were keys. Said people lost them all the time. His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided the image, flicking instead to the table, to the door, to anything that wasn't that small circle of metal that had survived where so much else had vanished. The room felt different after that. He knew they were closer. They knew he knew. The dance grew tighter, each step calculated. Detectives reviewed the original crime scene photos again, this time with the key ring in mind. The placement. The soil disturbance. The possibility that it had been dropped during a struggle, kicked aside, overlooked in the chaos of the discovery. A mistake. A human error. The kind that haunted cold cases because it was so easy to imagine. Outside, the world was unaware that the ground beneath an old narrative was shifting. To the public, Sarah Mitchell's case was still unsolved, still a relic of the 1990s. Inside the investigation, it felt alive again, volatile, threatening to combust if mishandled. Every decision carried risk. Move too fast, and the case could collapse. Move too slowly, and time could claim its final advantage. The suspect's life showed signs of strain. He missed work. His employer noted mood changes. He began selling off possessions, downsizing, as if preparing for something unnamed. When detectives tried to schedule another interview, he postponed, then canceled, then stopped responding entirely. His attorney stepped in, polite but firm, signaling a shift from cooperation to defense. That was the moment investigators had both anticipated and dreaded. The line had been crossed. Whatever came next would not be quiet. It would not be reversible. The cold case had warmed to the point where denial was no longer comfortable, and the hidden evidence, fibers, keys, memories, patterns, was exerting a gravitational pull that threatened to drag everything into the open. For decades, the case had been defined by absence. No suspect. No weapon. No closure. Now it was defined by accumulation, by the terrifying realization that truth doesn't always arrive whole, but in fragments sharp enough to cut. And as those fragments aligned, one by one, the question looming over Ohio was no longer whether the past could be disturbed, but what would happen when it finally refused to stay buried. The moment an attorney speaks for someone, the air changes. Conversations become measured. Words harden into strategy. What had once been an investigation guided by patience and persistence now carried the unmistakable weight of confrontation. The suspect no longer answered questions because he didn't have to, and that silence spoke louder than anything he had said before. For detectives, it was both confirmation and obstacle, a signal that they were close and a reminder of how fragile that closeness still was. Behind closed doors, the case was dissected again, this time not as a mystery but as an argument. Every piece of evidence was tested against the standard it would face in court. Fibers. Keys. Witness memories. Vehicle records. Each item was strong in isolation, persuasive in combination, but prosecutors needed more than persuasion. They needed inevitability. They needed a story that left no room for another explanation to breathe. They returned to the timeline, compressing it, squeezing it until it revealed pressure points. Sarah Mitchell left the bar around 10. Her car was found parked near her apartment later that night. Somewhere between those moments, she encountered the wrong person. Investigators mapped out possible routes, possible detours, the brief windows where two lives could have intersected without anyone noticing. The grain elevator wasn't on her direct path home, but it wasn't far either. A short deviation. A wrong turn prompted by trust, fear, or force. The roadside theory took center stage. A stalled car. Hazard lights. A request for help. It fit the fibers. It fit the keys. It fit the way Sarah's car was left behind, keys missing, as if she had stepped out intending to return. That theory was tested relentlessly. Detectives searched old dispatch logs for reports of broken-down vehicles that night. Nothing official surfaced, but that absence was telling too. Not every stop resulted in a call. Not every encounter was meant to be seen. They looked again at the suspect's movements that evening. His work records showed he clocked out earlier than usual. No one could say exactly where he went afterward. Friends he once drank with claimed not to remember seeing him. His phone records, sparse as they were in the mid-1990s, didn't place him anywhere else conclusively. He existed in a gray zone, unaccounted for at precisely the wrong time. Then there was the behavior after the crime. The cleaning. The upholstery replacement. The insurance claim. None of it illegal. All of it explainable. And yet, stacked together, it suggested urgency, not routine maintenance. Investigators consulted behavioral analysts, careful to avoid confirmation bias, but unwilling to ignore what experience had taught them. People who commit impulsive violence often fixate on erasing it, even when they don't fully understand what evidence they need to remove. They clean what they touched. They discard what reminds them. They move, not to escape, but to breathe. The ex-partner's statement gained new significance. She described a man who could be charming one moment and volatile the next, someone who reacted poorly to rejection, to perceived disrespect. Sarah Mitchell, quiet and alone, might have represented opportunity or insult. Investigators didn't need to prove motive in court, but they needed to understand it, to anticipate how the defense would try to dismantle the narrative. They prepared for arguments about coincidence, about unreliable memory, about the dangers of retrofitting guilt onto an ordinary life. Another review of the crime scene photos revealed something else that had been overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it was mundane. Tire impressions near the field, shallow and incomplete, dismissed in 1995 as too degraded to be useful. Technology had changed since then. Digital enhancement didn't create detail where none existed, but it could clarify patterns, spacing, angles. Analysts compared those impressions to the suspect's vehicle model. The match wasn't perfect. It never was. But the alignment was uncomfortable, close enough to force another uncomfortable meeting with prosecutors. They debated for hours. Voices rose, then quieted. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it was made. They would move forward, not with an arrest, but with a grand jury presentation. Let citizens hear the story. Let the accumulation of fragments speak. It was a risk. If the grand jury declined to indict, the case could lose momentum forever. But waiting carried its own danger. Evidence aged. Witnesses faltered. Time favored no one. The presentation was meticulous. No theatrics. No speculation. Just facts, laid end to end, forming a line that led back to one person over and over again. The fibers that placed Sarah in his car. The key that suggested proximity at the scene. The behavior that followed. The witnesses who remembered too late. The gaps in his timeline that never quite closed. The jurors listened, faces unreadable, absorbing a story that stretched back before some of them were adults. When the decision came, it arrived without ceremony. An indictment. Not for murder, proof of intent was still too thin, but for kidnapping resulting in death, a charge that acknowledged uncertainty while asserting responsibility. It was enough to bring him in. Enough to force the case into the light. The arrest happened early, before the town fully woke up. No sirens. No spectacle. Just officers at a door, a man stepping outside in handcuffs, neighbors watching through curtains without understanding why their street had suddenly become a crime scene. News broke quickly. Headlines resurfaced words long absent from local memory. Cold case. Ohio. 1995. Broken. For the community, shock gave way to disbelief. Some remembered Sarah Mitchell. Others had never heard her name before that morning. The idea that a killer had lived among them unnoticed for decades was harder to process than the crime itself. Conversations reignited. Old fears resurfaced. People searched their memories for signs they might have missed. For investigators, the work intensified. An indictment was not a victory. It was an invitation to be challenged, to defend every assumption, every inference. The defense moved quickly, attacking the age of the evidence, the reliability of witnesses, the danger of hindsight. They painted a picture of a man targeted because he was available, because coincidence had been mistaken for causation. And hovering over everything was the possibility that even now, even this close, the case could unravel. Cold cases carry a unique cruelty. They allow hope to grow slowly, painfully, only to threaten its destruction at the last moment. The hidden evidence had changed everything, but change did not guarantee justice. It only guaranteed confrontation. As the town braced for a trial that would force it to relive a winter-long past, one truth became impossible to ignore. The silence that had protected the crime for decades was finally broken, and whatever came next would echo far beyond a single courtroom. Courtrooms have their own climate, a controlled stillness that amplifies every sound, every movement, every breath drawn too sharply. When the trial began, it felt as though the temperature dropped, not from cold air but from expectation, from the weight of a past dragged into the present and forced to speak. Sarah Mitchell's name was read aloud again, formal and precise, stripped of the warmth it once carried, and for a moment the room held its breath. The prosecution moved carefully, knowing that spectacle would only weaken them. They framed the case as a sequence of moments rather than a single act, a chain of choices that led from a roadside encounter to a shallow grave. They spoke of trust exploited, of help offered and turned into harm, of a crime committed not with planning, but with impulse and opportunity. The fibers were introduced early, small and unassuming, magnified on a screen until they looked like veins, threads of a story running through everything else. Experts explained manufacturing processes, upholstery blends, production timelines. The language was technical, dry, but the implication was sharp. These fibers didn't float through the air. They didn't appear by accident beneath a fingernail. They required contact, force, resistance. The defense countered immediately, reminding the jury of probability, of how common such materials had been in the 1990s, of how easily coincidence could masquerade as meaning. Reasonable doubt was their refrain, repeated until it felt almost comforting. Witnesses followed. The bartender, older now, voice steadier than memory, recounting the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Mitchell. The gas station clerk, uncertain but sincere. The caller who remembered hazard lights blinking in the dark, a memory that had aged into something both fragile and heavy. Each account added texture, not certainty. The jury listened, measuring credibility, aware that time had not been kind to clarity. Then came the ex-partner. Her testimony changed the room. She didn't dramatize. She didn't accuse. She simply described what it had been like to live beside someone whose moods shifted without warning, whose anger simmered beneath ordinary gestures. She spoke of scratches, of late nights, of cleaning that felt compulsive rather than routine. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing relevance, prejudice, the danger of character assassination. The judge allowed just enough to stand. The line was thin. Everyone knew it. The keyring was presented next, held up like an artifact from another life. The prosecution didn't claim it was definitive. They didn't need to. They spoke instead about proximity, about likelihood, about how objects fall where people struggle. The defense seized on the mishandling, the years it spent forgotten in a garage, the broken chain of custody. They suggested contamination, mislabeling, the unreliability of anything that had passed through so many hands. The doubt they planted took root quickly. As days passed, the trial settled into a rhythm of assertion and erosion. Every advance met resistance. Every inference was challenged. Jurors took notes, faces closed, absorbing a narrative that refused to resolve cleanly. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, recycling phrases that had returned from the dead. Cold case. Breakthrough. Hidden evidence. Inside, the reality was messier, more human, less satisfying. The defendant watched it all with practiced neutrality. He didn't flinch at photographs. He didn't react when Sarah Mitchell's name was spoken. His attorneys whispered to him constantly, strategies adjusting in real time. When he finally took the stand, the room tightened. Defendants rarely did this, especially in cases built on accumulation rather than confession. His decision felt calculated, a gamble that his ordinariness would outweigh suspicion. He spoke calmly, confidently, about his life in the mid-1990s, about long workdays and quiet nights, about how easily memories blur over decades. He denied knowing Sarah Mitchell, denied stopping on the roadside, denied everything with a steadiness that forced the jury to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors. Cross-examination was relentless. The prosecution pressed him on the upholstery replacement, the insurance claim, the cleaning. Why then? Why so thorough? Why decline further inspection? He offered explanations that sounded reasonable in isolation. Spills. Where? Preference. When asked about the scratches described by his ex-partner, his composure wavered just enough to be noticed. He called them exaggerations. Old grievances resurfacing as accusation. The jury watched closely, searching for cracks. Closing arguments returned to fundamentals. The prosecution asked the jury to consider the weight of many small truths, how they aligned too neatly to dismiss. The defense urged restraint, warning against the seduction of narrative, the danger of filling gaps with suspicion. They reminded the jury that absence of proof was not proof of guilt, that the state had not shown exactly how Sarah Mitchell died, only that she did. Deliberations stretched on. Hours turned into days. Outside, the town held its breath, divided between hope and fear. When the jury finally returned, the verdict came with hesitation, not triumph. Guilty on the charge of kidnapping resulting in death. Not guilty on lesser counts tied to intent. A compromise verdict, some said. A reflection of doubt and belief coexisting uneasily. The sentence was handed down weeks later. Decades in prison. Not life. Not closure. Enough to acknowledge responsibility without answering every question. Sarah Mitchell's family, distant but present, listened in silence. There were no outbursts, no visible relief. Justice, when delayed this long, arrived quietly, stripped of ceremony. Yet even as the case closed on paper, something remained unresolved. The defense filed appeals immediately, citing evidentiary issues, chain of custody failures, the inherent unreliability of cold case prosecutions. Legal battles loomed, threatening to reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar over. And beyond the courtroom, beyond verdicts and sentences, lingered the uncomfortable awareness that not every detail had been illuminated. Cold cases promise answers. They rarely deliver them cleanly. What they offer instead is a reckoning, a forced confrontation with the past and its consequences. In Ohio, the winter of 1995 finally loosened its grip, but it did not disappear. It receded, leaving behind questions that refused to settle, echoes that followed everyone involved long after the gavel fell. The hidden evidence had changed everything. It had transformed absence into accusation, silence into testimony. But it had also revealed something darker, something harder to accept, that truth, once buried, does not emerge whole. It comes in fragments, sharp and incomplete, and when those fragments cut through decades of denial, they leave scars that no verdict can fully heal. The verdict didn't end the story. It destabilized it. The moment the courtroom emptied, the case began its second life, quieter but no less volatile, unfolding through filings, motions, and whispered conversations that never made the evening news. Cold cases rarely die with a sentence. They linger, suspended between what was proven and what was merely believed, and in that space, doubt finds room to breathe. The appeal was filed with surgical precision, targeting the weakest joints in the case's skeleton. Chain of custody. Memory contamination. The danger of retroactive meaning applied to mundane behavior. The defense argued that the trial had been less about evidence and more about atmosphere, that the weight of time had pressed jurors into seeing patterns where none existed. They framed the hidden evidence not as revelation, but as reinvention. Prosecutors responded in kind, emphasizing consistency, the improbability of coincidence stacked so high. They argued that while each piece alone might bend, together they formed something rigid, something that could not be easily dismissed without willful blindness. The battle moved from witness stands to written pages, from emotional testimony to cold legal language, each side trying to control the narrative long after the public had moved on. Inside the prison, the defendant settled into routine with unsettling ease. He filed grievances. He requested transfers. He spoke to anyone who would listen about injustice, about being made a symbol, about how the system had needed a villain to justify reopening a case it had failed to solve properly the first time. His words found sympathetic ears in some corners, particularly among those wary of cold case convictions built on circumstantial foundations. Doubt, once introduced, traveled fast. Meanwhile, detectives who had worked the case felt an unfamiliar unease. They had believed in what they built, in the careful assembly of fragments into something coherent. But belief was not immunity. Late at night, some of them revisited the file, not looking for validation, but for cracks they might have missed. Cold cases had a way of turning inward, forcing those who pursued them to question their own certainty. It was during one of those quiet reviews that a detail resurfaced, not from the crime scene, not from the lab, but from an overlooked administrative log. A routine entry. Evidence transfer. Date misaligned by a single day. It didn't invalidate anything on its own, but it introduced a wrinkle that defense attorneys seized upon immediately when it was disclosed. Another example, they said, of how time had degraded reliability, how memory and documentation had drifted apart. Public reaction fractured along predictable lines. Some saw the conviction as long overdue justice, proof that patience and technology could outlast even decades of silence. Others saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the hunger to solve old crimes could tempt institutions to stretch evidence beyond its breaking point. Talk radio filled the gaps, speculating freely, often irresponsibly. Sarah Mitchell's name was invoked again and again, sometimes with care, sometimes as shorthand for argument. Her story, once personal, had become symbolic. She was no longer just a woman who died in 1995. She was a test case, a measure of how much uncertainty society was willing to tolerate in the pursuit of closure. And in that transformation, something essential was lost. The human cost of the crime was overshadowed by debate, by theory, by the intellectual exercise of assigning probability to pain. The appeals court hearing was brief, procedural, almost anticlimactic. No witnesses. No drama. Just attorneys standing at podiums, distilling years of work into minutes of argument. The judges asked pointed questions, their tone neutral, their expressions unreadable. When the decision came months later, it landed without spectacle. Conviction upheld. No error sufficient to overturn. The law, at least for now, was satisfied. But satisfaction is not the same as certainty. Even with the appeal denied, the case refused to settle into history. New documentaries emerged, re-examining the evidence with fresh skepticism. Podcasts dissected the timeline, pausing on moments investigators had treated as peripheral. Armchair analysts proposed alternative scenarios, other suspects, other interpretations of the same fragments. The story fractured into versions, each competing for legitimacy. Some pointed to the hazard light sighting, questioning its reliability. Others fixated on the key ring, arguing it could have belonged to anyone, dropped at any time. The fibers, once heralded as the linchpin, were scrutinized under a harsher light, their specificity challenged, their uniqueness diluted by broader context. The hidden evidence, it seemed, could both illuminate and obscure, depending on who held it. For the investigators, this new phase was the hardest. Solving a case was one thing. Watching it be pulled apart in public, piece by piece, was another. They were bound by ethics and law, unable to respond to every accusation, every reinterpretation. Silence, once a protective shield, became a liability. The narrative no longer belonged to them. And yet, amid the noise, something unexpected happened. Tips began to come in again. Not the wild speculation of earlier years, but measured, thoughtful messages from people who had lived in the area in the 1990s and felt, perhaps for the first time, that their memories might matter. One mentioned a man seen arguing with a woman near a car that matched the suspect's description. Another recalled hearing shouting near the grain elevator, dismissed at the time as teenagers. None of it was definitive. All of it was late. But it suggested that the case still had gravity, still pulled at the edges of truth. Sarah Mitchell's grave, once rarely visited, saw more flowers. More notes. Messages written to someone most of the writers had never met. In those quiet gestures was an acknowledgement that the story had outgrown the courtroom, that its resolution, whatever one believed it to be, carried emotional weight beyond legal outcomes. Cold cases change form over time. They begin as investigations, become prosecutions, and end as narratives contested by memory and belief. In Ohio, the 1995 case had reached that final stage, a place where certainty was less important than reckoning, where the past could no longer be ignored even if it could never be fully known. And in that uneasy space, where justice and doubt coexisted, one truth remained unaltered. A life had been taken, a community had been marked, and the echoes of that winter night continued to ripple outward, refusing to fade, demanding attention long after the system had declared its work done. Time moved strangely after the appeal was denied, not forward so much as sideways, stretching moments into long, indistinct intervals where nothing appeared to happen and yet everything felt unresolved. The conviction stood, the sentence held, but the case refused to settle into quiet. It pulsed beneath the surface, resurfacing in conversations, in articles, in the uneasy pauses that followed whenever someone mentioned the year 1995 out loud. Inside the prison, the defendant adjusted to the rhythms of confinement with a discipline that unsettled those who watched him closely. He kept meticulous routines, requested library access, studied case law with the focus of someone preparing not for appeal alone but for vindication. Letters went out regularly, not just to attorneys, but to journalists, advocacy groups, anyone who might listen. In them, he repeated the same themes: coincidence mistaken for certainty, a life rewritten by hindsight, a system desperate to close a file it had failed to solve when it mattered most. Some of those letters found their way into public forums. Excerpts were read on podcasts, quoted in opinion pieces, dissected sentence by sentence. His voice, filtered through interpretation, began to compete with Sarah Mitchell's, not as a replacement but as a counterweight. The narrative shifted again, tilting toward ambiguity. Listeners were asked to imagine alternative explanations, other cars, other encounters, other men who had never been questioned because the spotlight had chosen him instead. Detectives followed this turn with a mix of frustration and restraint. They knew better than to chase public opinion. Still, the noise had consequences. Witnesses who might have come forward hesitated, unsure whether their memories would help or harm, whether they would be believed or torn apart. The past, once distant, now felt dangerous to touch. It was during this uneasy lull that a new review began, not as an official reopening, but as a quiet audit, initiated by a state-level cold case advisory board tasked with evaluating long-delayed prosecutions. Their mandate wasn't to retry cases, but to understand how they unfolded, to identify weaknesses before they became failures elsewhere. Sarah Mitchell's case was selected precisely because it sat on the fault line between persistence and uncertainty. The board's analysts approached the file without allegiance, without the emotional investment that years of work can create. They mapped evidence flows, flagged inconsistencies, and noted where assumptions might have hardened into conclusions. Their report, when it came, was careful, measured, and unsettling. The conviction, they said, was supported, but fragile. The evidence was cumulative, not decisive. Strong enough for a jury. Vulnerable to erosion over time. One paragraph drew particular attention. The fibers, it noted, had been contextualized effectively at trial, but remained probabilistic rather than unique. Advances in forensic databases since the trial suggested broader distribution than initially believed. Not exculpatory, not definitive, but enough to complicate certainty. The board recommended further testing, not because it expected reversal, but because unanswered questions were liabilities, not just for this case, but for the system itself. The recommendation landed heavily. Prosecutors debated whether reopening forensic analysis would strengthen their position or invite disaster. Defense attorneys, alerted immediately, framed it as validation of long-held concerns. The public read headlines stripped of nuance. Key evidence questioned, they said. The cold case, broken once already, threatened to fracture again. When additional testing was authorized, it was done under intense scrutiny. Independent labs, blind protocols, redundant verification. The fibers were compared against expanded databases, manufacturing records updated, distribution patterns mapped with far greater resolution than had been possible before. Weeks passed, then months. Each delay fed speculation, the absence of information filled with theory. The results, when released, were neither salvation nor condemnation. The fibers were still consistent with the suspect's vehicle model, still plausible, still significant. But they were no longer as rare as once believed. The universe had widened, not enough to collapse the case, but enough to dull its sharpest edge. Defense teams seized on the nuance, amplifying it into doubt. Prosecutors responded by emphasizing that consistency, not rarity, had always been the point. Amid this renewed tension, something else emerged, quietly, almost accidentally. A retired dispatcher, following coverage of the case, contacted authorities with a memory she had never shared because she had never been asked. On the night Sarah Mitchell disappeared, she recalled an incomplete call, one that dropped almost immediately, logged only as static and background noise. At the time, it had been dismissed as accidental. Now, decades later, she wondered if it had been fear. The call record was still there, buried deep in archive systems. Time-stamped within the narrow window investigators cared about. Location data was crude by modern standards, but it placed the call near a stretch of road not far from the grain elevator. Not proof. Never proof. But it shifted the map, nudged the narrative towards something more immediate, more desperate. The defense argued coincidence again. Dropped calls were common. Static meant nothing. The prosecution countered with context, with accumulation, with the relentless logic that had carried them this far. The case teetered, not toward collapse, but toward perpetual motion, a story that refused to conclude cleanly. For Sarah Mitchell, the developments were posthumous, abstract. For her family, they were exhausting. Each new headline reopened grief, forced them to defend a verdict they hadn't sought publicity for, or to confront the possibility that certainty might always remain out of reach. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was with a quiet insistence that whatever doubts remained, Sarah had been taken, violently, unjustly, and that fact deserved more attention than the mechanics of prosecution. The town watched from a distance, weary of reliving the past, but unable to look away. The grain elevator was gone, replaced by open ground and a small, unremarkable sign marking a development project that never quite materialized. People drove past without stopping, unaware of how much history lay beneath their tires. Cold cases are often described as frozen, but this one was anything but. It was fluid, reshaping itself with every new interpretation, every technological shift, every human memory dragged reluctantly into the light. The hidden evidence had changed everything once. Now it threatened to change everything again, not by revealing a new truth, but by reminding everyone how fragile the old one really was. And in that fragility lay the most unsettling possibility of all, that the case, broken after decades of silence, might never truly settle, destined instead to exist forever in the space between justice and doubt, where answers are partial and the past refuses to stay still. The first winter after the renewed testing felt colder than the ones before it, not because the snow fell heavier or the wind cut sharper, but because certainty had thinned. People spoke more carefully now, as if every sentence needed room to retreat. The case had slipped into a strange second life, no longer dormant, no longer resolved, hovering in a state of uneasy awareness where every development carried weight and none delivered closure. Inside the courthouse, file boxes were reopened with a kind of professional hesitation. Clerks handled documents as if they were fragile artifacts, aware that every margin note, every timestamp, Every overlooked form could become the next focal point. The prosecution reviewed its own work not defensively, but methodically, tracing decisions back to their origins, asking whether confidence had ever quietly substituted for proof. The defense did the same, assembling timelines that challenged not facts outright, but the spaces between them, the moments where assumptions had bridged gaps no one could fully see. Media coverage intensified, sharpening the edges of the story. Headlines compressed complexity into urgency. New doubt, they said. Forgotten call, they said. Cold case uncertainty deepens. The language mattered. It didn't accuse. It didn't exonerate. It unsettled. Listeners and readers were invited not to decide, but to question, and that invitation spread faster than any verdict ever had. Podcasts reconstructed the night again, minute by minute, sound effects layered beneath narration, footsteps on gravel, a distant engine idling, whined through tall grass. The grain elevator became a character, looming and silent, its shadow stretched across memory. Hosts asked questions no courtroom ever had time for. Why there? Why that hour? Why did no one hear anything? Each question echoed, unanswered, amplifying the sense that something essential had slipped through unseen. The dropped call became a fixation. Analysts speculated about pocket dials, accidental triggers, brief moments of panic. Audio engineers debated whether static could mask a voice. Amateur sleuths triangulated cell tower ranges using outdated maps and modern software, building theories that looked convincing enough to frighten those who understood their limitations. The call itself never spoke again. It remained a ghost, present only as data, its silence louder than any recorded sound. Law enforcement responded by tightening its public posture. Statements grew shorter. Updates became rarer. Investigators knew the danger of overexposure, how speculation could contaminate memory, how witnesses might unconsciously reshape recollections to fit narratives already circulating. Still, behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. The case had returned to motion, and motion demanded direction. A task force meeting convened quietly, its attendance smaller than in earlier years, but no less serious. New faces joined old ones, analysts trained in behavioral profiling, forensic statisticians accustomed to explaining probability to skeptical audiences. They reviewed everything again, not linearly but thematically, mapping motive, opportunity, means, and aftermath across overlapping layers. Patterns emerged, not definitive, but suggestive, clusters of possibility that hinted at alternative pathways the investigation might have taken. One such pathway led away from the familiar suspect and toward a figure long dismissed as peripheral. A man mentioned briefly in early reports, interviewed once, never followed up. His alibi had been accepted quickly, supported by a friend who later moved out of state. At the time, there had been no reason to push harder. Now, with hindsight sharpened by doubt, that decision looked less like efficiency and more like risk. Records were pulled. Addresses traced. The man's name surfaced in unrelated police reports over the years, minor incidents, nothing violent, but enough to suggest a life lived close to instability. Investigators debated whether reopening that thread would illuminate the past or simply create another shadow. In cold cases, every new lead carries the danger of distraction. They moved carefully, contacting him through intermediaries, framing questions broadly, non-accusatory. His responses were measured, cooperative, almost rehearsed. He remembered little of that night, he said. Too long ago. Memory fades. When pressed gently, he repeated details that aligned with his original statement, but the ease with which he did so raised quiet concerns. Some memories fade unevenly. Others harden. The defense learned of the renewed interest through leaks, as defense teams often do. They seized the moment, filing motions that cited investigative bias, arguing that the original suspect had been fixed too early, that alternative explanations had been neglected. The prosecution countered that revisiting peripheral figures demonstrated thoroughness, not doubt. The courtroom became a place where process itself was on trial. For Sarah Mitchell's family, the developments blurred together a constant hum of legal language and media speculation that offered little comfort. They had lived with absence long enough to understand that truth did not always arrive cleanly, but the idea that certainty might dissolve after being declared felt like a second loss. They avoided cameras, declined interviews, and spoke privately of exhaustion, of a desire for the world to let the past rest, even if it could never truly be resolved. The town adjusted its posture again. Conversations that had once been confident now softened. People remembered differently, not facts, but feelings. The fear of 1995 resurfaced, not as panic, but as a low, persistent unease. Parents who had been children then told their own kids stories that ended without lessons, only warnings. Be careful. Trust slowly. Some nights don't explain themselves. As winter turned toward spring, a new report landed quietly on the desks of attorneys on both sides. It concerned soil samples collected near the original site and stored for decades. Advances in analysis had revealed trace compounds not previously detectable, residues that suggested prolonged contact between the body and a surface inconsistent with the location where Sarah had been found. The implication was subtle, technical, but profound. It suggested movement, not just after death, but possibly before. The revelation didn't rewrite the case, but it bent it, nudging timelines, complicating assumptions about where critical moments had occurred. Defense experts argued that it undermined the prosecution's narrative. Prosecutors emphasized that movement had always been considered possible. Again, the truth sat between interpretations, elusive and resistant. Public reaction was swift. Online forums erupted. Theories multiplied. Some pointed to organized concealment. Others to impulsive violence followed by panic. A few clung harder to the original verdict, seeing every new detail as confirmation of how deeply hidden the truth must have been. The cold case, once broken, now fractured into competing certainties. And through it all, the voice of the case remained absent. Sarah Mitchell never spoke. Her story was told by evidence, by inference, by the echoes left behind. The danger of such stories is not that they lack answers, but that they invite too many, each shaped by the fears and desires of those who tell them. By the time the first flowers appeared along the roadsides, the case had reached another threshold. Not a conclusion. Not a reversal. A moment where all involved understood that whatever came next would not restore simplicity. Justice, if it moved again, would do so under the weight of doubt, scrutiny, and the knowledge that some truths, once questioned, can never return to their original form. The cold case continued to breathe, unevenly, sustained by uncertainty, its hidden evidence no longer a key but a mirror, reflecting the limits of memory, investigation, and belief, and reminding everyone who watched that some stories do not end. They only deepen. By the time summer settled over Ohio, the case had reached a point where movement itself felt dangerous. Every action risked tipping the balance one way or another, not toward resolution, but toward irrevocable consequence. Investigators spoke less in absolutes now. Language shifted. Words like possible, consistent, and cannot be ruled out replaced the firm declarations that once anchored the narrative. The cold case had entered its most volatile phase, where clarity was promised by no one and expected by everyone. Behind closed doors, prosecutors faced a question they rarely confront publicly: whether certainty is something you defend at all costs, or something you reassess when the ground beneath it begins to move. The conviction had not been overturned. The sentence remained intact. But the accumulation of nuance, of revised probabilities and emerging ambiguities had begun to weigh heavily. Justice, they knew, is not only about winning a case. It is about standing by it when scrutiny intensifies. The defense sensed the shift immediately. Their strategy sharpened, not towards spectacle, but precision. They stopped arguing innocence outright and focused instead on fragility, on how the case depended on interlocking assumptions that now showed hairline fractures. They filed motions designed not to exonerate, but to destabilize, to force the court to confront how much uncertainty it was willing to tolerate in exchange for finality. A hearing was scheduled, narrow in scope but immense in implication. It was not a retrial. It was a review of evidentiary integrity in light of new forensic context. The courtroom filled quietly, not with crowds, but with tension. Reporters took notes without chatter. Observers leaned forward. Everyone understood that whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this room. Experts testified in measured tones, careful not to overstate, careful not to retreat. They spoke of fiber transfer rates, of environmental contamination, of how probability shifts as databases expand. They explained soil chemistry, how trace compounds adhere, how movement leaves signatures invisible to older methods. Their words were technical, restrained, but the effect was electric. Each sentence loosened something once thought immovable. The prosecution responded with context, with narrative coherence, reminding the court that cases are not built on single pieces of evidence, but on convergence. They argued that uncertainty had always existed, that the system does not demand perfection, only reasoned judgment. The defense countered that reasoned judgment depends on knowing where speculation begins. Back and forth it went, not as confrontation, but as excavation, layers peeled back slowly, deliberately. Outside the courtroom, the public absorbed fragments. Headlines condensed hours of testimony into phrases that sounded more decisive than reality allowed. Key evidence challenged, they read. Court re-examines cold case foundation. The effect was cumulative. Confidence eroded not because guilt had been disproven, but because certainty had been diluted. Inside the prison, the defendant followed every development with meticulous attention. He marked dates, annotated transcripts, wrote letters that were less emotional now, more strategic. He spoke of process, of precedent, of how history would judge not just the verdict, but the willingness to question it. Whether sincere or calculated, his composure unsettled those who expected desperation. Sarah Mitchell's family did not attend the hearing. They had learned that presence did not equal control, that proximity to the process often amplified pain without offering clarity. They followed updates through intermediaries, bracing themselves for outcomes that felt increasingly abstract. Their loss was personal, unchanging. The legal shifts felt distant, almost academic, yet carried the power to reshape the story told about her life and death. When the judge recessed to consider arguments, the silence that followed felt heavier than any ruling. Days passed, then weeks. During that time, the case existed in suspension, neither advancing nor retreating, held in the collective breath of everyone who had invested in its outcome. Cold cases often linger, but this one hovered, poised on the edge of transformation without revealing its direction. The ruling, when it came, was cautious. The court acknowledged the evolving forensic landscape, recognized the legitimacy of raised concerns, but stopped short of overturning anything. Instead, it ordered continued review, further expert consultation, a commitment to transparency rather than immediacy. It was not an answer. It was a deferral, a signal that the story was not finished. Reactions were predictably divided. Some saw restraint as wisdom, a refusal to act rashly in the face of complexity. Others saw avoidance, a system reluctant to confront the consequences of doubt. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between perception and intention. What mattered was that the case had been formally unsettled again, its status no longer fixed. As autumn approached, new interviews were conducted, not because fresh witnesses had emerged, but because old ones were willing to speak differently. Time alters not memory itself, but the courage to question it. People who had once been certain admitted uncertainty. Others clung tighter to what they believed they saw. The past fractured into overlapping versions, each sincere, each incomplete. Investigators revisited locations with modern tools, scanning ground that had already been searched, mapping spaces thought long exhausted. The grain elevator site, now empty, yielded nothing new, but its emptiness felt symbolic. So much attention focused on a place that no longer existed, a reminder that environments change even as questions remain. Throughout it all, the phrase cold case took on a different meaning. This was no longer a file reopened after decades of neglect. It was a case kept deliberately unresolved, held open by awareness of its own limitations. The hidden evidence that once promised closure now served as a caution, a reminder that revelation does not always simplify, and that answers, once uncovered, can multiply questions instead. By the end of the year, the community had settled into a new kind of waiting. Not for justice to arrive, but for understanding to stabilize. The case continued to cast its shadow, long and diffuse, touching institutions, families, and strangers who had never known Sarah Mitchell, but felt compelled by the gravity of her absence. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been undone. The story remained intact yet altered, like a photograph exposed too many times, its edges blurred by competing truths. And as the cold returned to Ohio, the case remained suspended between past and present, no longer silent, no longer settled, carrying forward the uneasy knowledge that once doubt enters a verdict, it never truly leaves. The final stage of the case did not arrive with sirens or sudden revelation. It came quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the truth itself understood the damage certainty could cause when handled too roughly. Years had passed since the first headline declared the cold case broken, and yet the word broken now felt less like solved and more like fractured, a reminder that some answers crack open instead of sealing shut. By now, the investigation had become something else entirely. It was no longer a search for a single decisive moment, a smoking gun hidden in plain sight. It had transformed into an examination of process, memory, and belief. Detectives spoke of the case in reflective tones, not defensive, not triumphant, but measured, as if aware they were participating in something larger than a verdict. Younger officers studied it as a lesson. Older ones carried it like a weight. The final comprehensive review was commissioned not by pressure, but by fatigue. An exhaustion with ambiguity that demanded acknowledgement rather than resolution. Independent experts were brought in again, not to reanalyze every fiber or retest every sample, but to answer a simpler, more dangerous question: was the outcome still trustworthy in light of everything now known? The review took months. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a forensic autopsy of the investigation itself. Decisions were traced. Paths not taken were catalogued. Biases, both conscious and invisible, were named without accusation. The report that emerged was not dramatic. It did not declare innocence. It did not proclaim error. It spoke instead of limits, of how evidence functions within time, how certainty degrades as context expands. One sentence, buried deep in the findings, carried disproportionate weight. It stated that while the conviction could not be conclusively disproven, neither could it be reaffirmed with the confidence once claimed. The language was careful, restrained, devastating in its restraint. It meant that the case, for all its effort, would never return to the clarity it once possessed. The legal system responded the only way it could. No reversal. No exoneration. No new trial. The conviction remained, but with an asterisk no document could erase. Appeals slowed. Media attention thinned. The machinery of justice, having examined itself, moved on, leaving behind a record heavy with footnotes and unresolved questions. Inside prison walls, time continued its blunt, indifferent march. The defendant aged quietly, his correspondence slowing, his arguments narrowing. He spoke less of freedom now, more of legacy, of how history would remember a case that refused to settle. Whether guilty or wronged, he remained defined by the same absence that defined everyone else in this story, the absence of certainty. Sarah Mitchell's name, however, endured differently. It was spoken less often in headlines and more carefully in private. Her family marked anniversaries without cameras, without statements, without expectations. They learned to live with an outcome that neither fully satisfied nor fully collapsed, a truth that felt permanently incomplete. Justice, they realized, does not always heal. Sometimes it simply stabilizes the pain enough to endure. The town, too, changed. New people moved in, unaware of why certain streets felt heavier at night, why older residents avoided specific intersections without explanation. Memory faded at the edges, but the center held. There were still moments, quiet ones, when the past surfaced unexpectedly, in a conversation, in a passing reference, in the way silence lingered a second too long after the year 1995 was mentioned. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but this one never was. It lived. It shifted. It aged alongside the people bound to it. It taught those who followed it that truth is not always a destination, but a boundary, one you approach carefully, aware that crossing it too quickly can distort what lies on the other side. In the end, there was no final revelation, no confession that rewrote history, no hidden file that closed the book once and for all. There was only an understanding, hard-earned and deeply unsettling, that some cases resist resolution not because the truth is unreachable, but because it is too complex to fit into a single conclusion. The Ohio 1995 cold case remained what it had become, not unsolved, not solved, but permanently altered. A story carried forward by evidence that changed everything and certainty that never returned. And long after the last motion was filed, long after attention moved elsewhere, the case continued to echo, a low, persistent reminder that justice, once questioned, leaves behind a shadow that time alone cannot erase. What remained after everything else fell away was not an answer, but a presence. The case lingered in the background of ordinary days, surfacing when no one expected it, a familiar weight returning without announcement. It no longer demanded attention with headlines or hearings. It simply existed, steady and unresolved, like a scar that no longer aches but never disappears. The records were archived again, this time with annotations layered over the originals, digital shadows attached to paper truths. Future investigators would open the file and feel the density of it immediately, the way facts pressed against one another without locking into place. They would see how time had complicated what once seemed straightforward, how progress had widened the lens instead of sharpening it. They would understand, almost instinctively, that this was a case you did not rush. Occasionally, a new technology sparked a brief flicker of interest. A tool designed to see deeper, to analyze finer, to extract meaning from fragments once thought inert. Each time, the question returned with renewed urgency: should it be used? Not because it might change the outcome, but because it might change belief. The answer was never simple. Advancement carries promise, but it also carries consequence, and those who had lived through the turbulence knew the cost of reopening wounds that never truly closed. The evidence itself aged in silence. Fibers sealed in envelopes. Soil samples reduced to data points. Transcripts frozen in the language of their time. They did not argue. They did not insist. They waited, passive witnesses to interpretations that shifted around them. Evidence does not speak. People do. And people change. In classrooms and training sessions, the case became a reference, a cautionary example used not to assign blame, but to teach restraint. Instructors spoke of tunnel vision, of the danger of narrative gravity pulling every fact toward a single center. They emphasized humility, the understanding that solving a case does not end its story, and that certainty, once declared, must be protected not by stubbornness, but by continuous examination. For some, the case inspired vigilance. For others, it bred skepticism. Both reactions carried truth. Justice systems rely on confidence to function, but they survive on doubt. The balance between the two is delicate, and this case had shown how easily it can tip. Years passed. New crimes captured attention. New tragedies demanded outrage. The Ohio 1995 cold case slipped further from public conversation, but it never vanished completely. It lived on in footnotes, in whispered references, in the way certain professionals paused when discussing finality. It lived on in the understanding that closure is not guaranteed, no matter how long you search for it. The people most closely tied to the case aged quietly. Some retired. Some passed away. Their voices, once dominant, became echoes recorded in interviews and depositions. What they remembered mattered less than how they had remembered it, the confidence or hesitation embedded in their words. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, rebuilt every time it is accessed, shaped by what we know now as much as by what we saw then. Sarah Mitchell's absence remained constant, untouched by reinterpretation. She did not age. She did not revise her story. She existed as she always had in this narrative, defined by the moment everything stopped. Her name continued to anchor the case, a reminder that beyond legal arguments and forensic nuance, a life had been interrupted, violently and irrevocably. Sometimes, on quiet nights, locals still drove the roads near where it had happened, not out of obsession, but habit. The landscape had changed, but muscle memory had not. The darkness felt familiar. The silence felt heavier there. No markers explained why. No signs instructed reflection. The place held its meaning without assistance. The cold case did not end with a verdict overturned or reaffirmed. It ended the way many real stories do, by fading into a complicated truth that resists simplification. It taught those who followed it that resolution is not always the measure of justice, and that the pursuit of answers can reveal as much about our limits as our capabilities. In the final accounting, nothing new emerged to rewrite the past. There was no final document, no last-minute revelation waiting patiently to be discovered. There was only the accumulation of understanding, slow and imperfect, shaped by time, technology, and the willingness to look again without expecting satisfaction. The Ohio 1995 cold case remained open in the only way that mattered. Open to interpretation. Open to scrutiny. Open to the uncomfortable reality that some questions survive every attempt to silence them. And long after the last file was closed for the night, long after the last expert weighed in, the case continued to exist in the space between knowing and believing, where certainty fades and the truth, whatever it is, waits without promise of being found.